What's up guys, Lifting here. This is a video build guide for the Molten Strike Brutus Lead Sprinkler Berserker I've been playing recently. This is the highest single target DPS character that I have ever played. It is incredibly powerful against something like the Shaper or in general any single target setup. For map clearing it's like average, I'd say. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It does it all right, but you can see that from the gameplay here. And also, if you guys want to see more gameplay, the most recent video of this build was like a boss montage where I take on the end game with this. So you can check that out. I'll link that in the description of the video. But in this video, we're mostly just going to talk about the build itself as a guide and go over what you need to do if you want to set it up. And as with any of my build guides, you can find more information, details in the description of the video. So check that out. But before we continue, let me just give you a slight warning here so you know what you're going into. There are some situations where you are attacking and you are waiting for the balls to hit the enemy. And in that short amount of time, you will not be leeching appropriately or enough. This can get a little dangerous, and I honestly don't think this is something you should try on hardcore unless you build it much more defensively, even though I consider it a fairly tanky build in many ways. But because of that delay, and it is leech that you rely on, maybe not the best hardcore build to try out. And also, it's not something I would do lab runs with. It's really good against Desaro. It destroys him easily, but because you're playing as a Berserker, you take that 10% increased damage, and that's goes for the traps too, and it makes it really dangerous. And you're only using one life flask. That is of course something you can just swap out, but yeah, you're also using wall pack, so you have no regen. Not so nice in the lab. But what it does really well is that single target setup. That is why I made this build. I wanted a boss killer. It's also fairly easy to level, and I'll tell you how to do that later. And it has some very insane leech mechanics. Basically, when you take a lot of damage, you get that savage proc as the Berserker and you leech 100% back. This makes you almost unkillable against anything except if they can one-shot you. And so let's quickly take a look at the Berserker here. The order of which you have to take your Berserker points is Pain Reaver for that leech, and then Cloaked in Savagery, and this is what gives you that insane leech. Then you want to go for Crave the Slaughter, attack speed and movement speed, and then finally Aspect of Carnage for 40% more damage. This is very powerful, but the 10% increased damage, you can feel that too. So as for the gear, we're using 2 Brutus Lead Sprinklers and try to get the ones with high attack speed. The way this works is that the more strength you have, the more fire damage they are going to deal. So with this build, you scale the damage via strength and of course everything else that benefits melee and elemental damage. Currently my character has 1047 strength. You can definitely get more than that, but I found out that once you get it to this point, the damage is already really good, and then scaling some attack speed just makes it so much nicer. And it is also for that reason that I'm using a Devoto's Devotion. Not only does it help me with those dexterity requirements, allowing me to use the skill points on something else or, easing up on my gear, but it gives that very nice attack speed, and you don't really care about the reduced physical damage you deal because it is fire. Besides that, you also get the movement speed, and that just makes it so much nicer when you're mapping or in fights where you have to run away. For instance, the Shaper, when you have to run away from the Slame. I'm also using Belly of the Beast, and I'm mainly using this just to increase my life more. With this skill tree, with this build, you are a little skill point starved, and I think in the skill tree I get up to 180, 190% or something like that. But then when you use a Belly of the Beast, you make up for that. You get that up to 40% increased maximum life. It's very nice for this build. I'm also using Soft's Blood for more life and mainly fire penetration. It also gives you that avatar of fire, which is nice. It converts that small amount of physical damage that the sprinklers provide. it's not too important. And it's definitely not worth picking up Avatar of Fire until you get Self's Blood. At least not in my opinion. Alternatively, you can also use an Astramentis. And Astramentis will most likely give you higher tooltip DPS, but that doesn't take into account the 10% fire penetration that you get with this. So overall, Softs is going to be stronger, and that more life is useful too. Then to scale the strength, I'm using Alberon's Warpath, and well, they only have 20% increased movement speed, but you make up with that with the Devotos. The important thing here is that it gives 18% increased strength. So if I take these off, you can see I'm down to 900. With these, it almost gives us 150 strength just by themselves. Oh, and I forgot to mention, instead of Devotos, if you can make it work with the attributes, the Black Crest Sun Helmet is very powerful. It also gives you percent increase to strength, but yeah, that's up to you. The important thing on the helmet is, however, you get that 3 additional Molten Strike projectiles. It makes a huge difference in damage output. Then for the final unique thing, I'm using the Wise Oak Flask, and this is just to get 20% fire resistance penetration. And the important thing is that your fire penetration needs to be the highest of all your resistances, or equal to all of them. Because when it's equal or higher, the oak works so that it will give fire penetration. If it was cold, it would give cold penetration. So make sure this is your highest one. And it also gives damage mitigation to the lowest of your resistances. So in this case, it gives me mitigation for cold and lightning. If they were all equal, you would get, well, the benefit for both damage and mitigation to all elements. My rare gear, gloves, belt, rings, these are all about getting some armor, getting strength so you can scale the damage, and then of course just enough life and resistances so that you are covered on merciless difficulty. And what you're seeing here could definitely be improved. You could get some sick opal rings for elemental damage, weapon elemental damage, things like that, for a very nice damage boost. But these things are very expensive, and well, I didn't really feel like I needed it. But if you really want to take it to the max. My skill gem setup is Molten Strike, Multi-Strike, Elemental Focus, Fire Pen, Weapon Elemental Damage, and Concentrated Effect. When you're mapping, I suggest taking Increased Area of Effect instead, but Conk Effect absolutely for bosses. It's important that you don't get too much area of effect to in the skill tree, because that makes it so that the balls will spread out too far and they won't overlap and deal as much damage or hit the enemy. And that's why Concentrated Effect is really nice too. It solves that issue. Then to further increase the damage of the Molten Strike, I'm also using Ancestral War Chief, putting that down in a boss fight. And I can show you, if we look at the tooltip right now, it is 72,000 with the War Chief up. It is 48, and with the Silver Flask up, it's 94,000. So it does make a pretty big difference, the totem here. And I've linked that with faster attacks, fire pen, and elemental focus. And then I'm also running flammability, and I just self-cast that when I encounter a boss. You don't need it for trash or anything like that. So to not waste support gems or reserve more mana or anything like that, I simply just self-cast it. I'm using Enlighten together with Grace and Anger. Anger adds a lot of damage. Right now it's 72. If we turn off Anger, it's 63. It makes a pretty big difference. And Grace is of course there to give us more evasion. But since this character is an Iron Reflex character, that evasion is converted into, armor. Gives you mitigation that way instead. And that's also why something like the Belly of the Beast that we're using, which is a hybrid armor evasion, and the Devotos, they give you that extra value now because it is converted to armor. Then in my gloves, I have the classic cast when damage taken, Immortal Call, Summon Flame Golem, and Increased Duration setup. Pretty straightforward. In my sprinklers, I have Fortify, Leap Slam, and faster attacks. I have Blade Fall, cast when damage taken, and Vortex in the other one here. You could also add in Firestorm probably, because it would scale a little more with the elemental damage. But the point of this setup here is that sometimes you take damage from afar, you will be hit by ranged attacks, and you can't leech then. But once the cast when damage taken then procs, pulls out the blade fall, that will leech back to you. And especially if it's been a savage hit, this can heal you back to full life. If it isn't a savage hit, it doesn't make too much of a difference. A bit, but still. As for the skill tree, it is a life, strength, focused build scaling melee damage and elemental damage. For keystones, I'm using Resolute Technique to get 100% chance to hit. And I did try earlier to go Elemental Overload and, well, rely on accuracy, but it simply turned out to be too unreliable. And I think my accuracy was, or chance to hit was 71 at that point. When I changed over to Resolute Technique, it just felt so much better. It also means that when you use your Leap Slam, you always hit when there's a monster, so the Fortify is a little more reliable. I'm also using Iron Grip. It doesn't do that much of a difference because it is mainly physical that it applies to. However, there is a slight amount that gets converted, and for 1 point, I feel like it's worth it. If you look it up in PoE building, you can also see the damage increase that you get from this. But it's only worth it because it's 1 point. Then I'm using Iron Reflexes, as I talked about just before, for the armor conversion or evasion conversion to armor. Point blank for our projectiles to deal much more damage, 50% more. And then finally, Vol Pact up here, and that's what allows us to just face tank things with the Savage Hit Ascendancy, the Cloaked in Savagery. These two together are absolutely insane. You can face tank the Shaper's Beam, for instance. He can't kill you when you do that. So that's how it is. This is the skill tree. You get a bit of projectile damage too, and I have some mana nodes just to help a little bit with it. I'm not sure it's necessary anymore, but it also gives a bit of intelligence, helps with it. And I have some aura nodes just to give me a little more wiggle room for my aura setup. And now one thing that's really, really important, and you should get these as soon as possible, that is the Wildfire Jewels. These are new jewels. What they do is that they increase your fire damage, and if you have 40 strength in the radius, you will get your Molten Strike to fire 2 additional projectiles, and they get increased area of effect. So when you have 2 of these, you'll get 4 additional projectiles and 50% increased area of effect. That's also why it's in no way necessary to get any of the area nodes. And also keep in mind, as I said earlier, you don't want too much area of effect because then they spread too thin. So the Wildfire Jewels, get them as soon as you can. And I placed mine here and another one here. And to give you more strength, there's also 2 excellent dexterity zones where you can place the Inertia Gem. So it converts allocated dexterity in radius to strength. So for this we get 20 strength, 30, 40, 50, and then plus the 23. So if I take this out, you can see it makes a pretty big difference. It's almost 100 strength here. Or it's, yeah. And the same things for this inertia up here. It converts the dex from this here, 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 and here, and then up here too. Very powerful. You may also have to get like a single or maybe even 2 jewels with a bit of resistances on, just to help you cover that, and then get it with fire damage and attack speed or whatever you feel like is necessary for the builds. Now, as for how to level this build, I simply used Molten Strike from the beginning. It's not the fastest, but I did it. Just make sure you add in those Wildfire Jewels as soon as possible. It makes a big difference. Also, try to get your Ascendancy, your first Ascendancy, Leech Ascendancy, as soon as possible, so you don't have to worry about sustaining. You can also consider buying yourself a Limbsplit and a Wideswing Axe to help with the early level damage. Maybe even something like 2 Screaming Eagles. At least it takes you to level 28 pretty fast. And once you get to level 28, you can start using the Brutus Lead Sprinklers. And then you just, well, roll from there. And that's what I wanted to show you guys. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give the channel a subscribe for more Path of Exile content. Thank you for watching. And bros, do you even nerd?